Everybody, welcome to today's ANROWS webinar that is titled Using an Action Research Project Story Template for Reporting on Building Safe Communities for Women and Their Children Work. I'm Tina Campbell and I'm today's facilitator. In a moment I'll introduce you to the ANROWS team, Liz Ors and Stephanie Howard. But before I do that, I'd just like to quickly run through the control panel that you have in front of you and tell you a little bit about the format of today's session. So you have a control panel in front of you and you can see that your microphone is muted. You can hear us, but at this point in time we can't hear you. The format of today's session is that it will be broken up throughout. There will be some opportunities for questions, and the best way to actually ask Liz the questions is to type them into the field at the bottom of the control panel. So you just pop your cursor into the control panel, type in your question, hit submit, and Stephanie will be in the background there looking after the questions and making sure that Liz is aware of them throughout. At those various question stages, we may also unmute you so that you can have a conversation with Liz. So we'll see how that goes. But the most efficient way to ask questions is to actually type them into the field. I'd like to introduce Liz and Stephanie now. Liz, who you're all familiar with, I'm sure, is leading the ARS project and has a substantial action research track record, including as the evaluation manager at the Secretariat of National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare, and as a senior project officer with the Stronger Families Learning Exchange at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. She has collaboratively designed and facilitated action research training and worked alongside a broad range of community providers to implement action research. And Stephanie Howard is a project officer for the ARS project. Stephanie comes from a community project management and quality improvement background, working in diverse roles in the government and non-government sectors, including work with refugee background communities and remote Indigenous communities. So it's with pleasure that I introduce Liz Ors. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you, Tina. And I'd also like to welcome everyone and start the webinar by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from East St Kilda, which I believe is the lands of the Boonwurrung of the Kulin Nations. Our ANROWS office in Melbourne is actually on Wurundjeri land. But I want to also acknowledge that people are joining us from all over Australia, and on your behalf to pay our respects to Aboriginal elders past and present, acknowledge ancestors and the role of emerging leaders. Now, I'm going to turn off my webcam during this presentation and perhaps turn it on at different points. The presentation is really a bit of a lecture style with a PowerPoint presentation, but we will have the opportunity to hear questions from you throughout the time that we are together during this webinar. Now I'm going to ask Tina if she would mind moving us along to that outline of what we're covering in today's session. So as well as the acknowledgement of country, I'd like to also remind people that given the topic that we are working with, if not directly at the front line, it can raise issues for people, and to remind you that there is the 1-800 RESPECT number if there are any issues that you need to discuss with a counsellor. In this presentation, I'm going to go a little bit through the background of ANROWS and the Action Research Project, then talk about multi-purposing, where we're trying to suggest that this template might be able to be used for more than one purpose. Then discuss the template, what is a project story template, talk about stories and narratives and how they are used in action research, so a little bit about the theory and method. And then we're going to talk through 3 different examples of how some of our projects have already been using the template. So ANROWS, as you probably all know, is an independent, not-for-profit company that was established under Australia's national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. It's jointly funded by Commonwealth and all state and territory governments. But the vision is to be an innovative research organisation and to deliver, the mission is to deliver relevant and translatable or usable research evidence. I'm just going to allow, thank you, Tina. There may be at times a little bit of a lag, so I hope that's not, I'm sure you'll get used to it, to our participants. So here, this particular slide is making the point that ultimately the work of ANROWS aims to be a benefit for women and children, but our stakeholders are both government, service providers and researchers. The ANROWS operating model shows that it's a connection of both knowledge production, so our research program produces knowledge. We look at the translation and exchange of that knowledge through a suite of publications, capacity events, and research conferences and forums that we either host or present at. And also ANROWS provides leadership through engagement with ministers, senior officials, task force of, that are in our specific area looking at violence against women and children, and by contributing to that national research agenda. The ANROWS research program includes research that is funded through the core grant, that is money that is provided through the Commonwealth Government, and there are other streams of work that ANROWS is involved with, including a perpetrator intervention research stream, national community attitudes to violence against women survey, diversity data, the Queensland project and the Victorian Family Violence Index. And here on this slide you'll see we've made a different colour to indicate this particular project, the Action Research Support Project. Now in the next slide we'll show you that this project is a 2-year funded contract that ANROWS has with the Department of Social Services to provide action research support to 40 grant projects that are funded by the Building Safer Communities Grants program. And that support takes the form of webinars such as this. We've already provided 2 webinars that are available online through our webpage on the ANROWS website, and workshops. We've hosted 2 specific topics, but in 3 different locations, workshops for the Building Safe Communities. Plus, we aim to visit each and every one of the Building Safe Community projects to work alongside those projects in how they're designing and implementing their action research. So the project's actually modelled itself on an action research approach, whereby if we look at the next slide, you can see we plan for using that action research plan, act, collect and reflect. The next slide will show you that we use that model before each workshop and webinar, so it's informed in that way. Now here I did also mean to acknowledge that we have invited to this webinar also the Department of Social Services Grant Administration Managers from each jurisdiction. They hadn't attended our webinars before. On occasion they've been able to attend the workshops, and I wanted both to welcome them and also let everyone know that your grant managers are possibly on this webinar as well. Now, if we move along to the next slide, I just wanted to let you know that we will be looking at the overall project story template, which was sent out to you with the reminder about the webinar, and I'm hoping that you'll have a copy of it with you, because whilst we will refer to it specifically, it's quite long, and already these slides have a lot of text. So we may not be having all the sub-questions to the story template, but the purpose, if we can come back to that now, of the template is to use it as a guide in your projects, to reflect with your project participants, get their input into what the project's been doing and where you're up to. We're suggesting that it could be used as part of your reporting to the Department of Social Services, so that you would look at what did you say your activities from your work plan would be, and you could talk to them. But you may also need to add in a section about how you'd spent the money to be accountable back for that. The third purpose was to reflect on the work that you've done in terms of what have been the challenges, what have been the successes, and what are the learnings that you might be able to share with other communities or community projects about this building safe community work. And we would like to suggest that if the projects are keen for this, we could combine all your stories together into a publication that could be available from the website or even as a printed publication. Now, clearly, all of those purposes require you to think through whether you would want to identify your community and the particular people involved, or whether you would want to write your story with some form of anonymity. If you decided in both instances, actually, it would be ethical to get the consent of your participants. It's important to try and include any diversity of views and different aspects of the project. And it doesn't only have to be written. You could include photographs, or even these days with all our amazing technology, you can include little audio clips, particularly if you're doing a project story using this type of format like a PowerPoint presentation. So I just want to say, as we are about to move into the discussion of the template, that the examples that we're using have been kindly shared by at least 3, if not more, of the Building Safe communities. And depending on the time we have, we'll go back at the end of the presentation to look at the bigger story. But here's the outline of the main questions and domains that we have in that project story. So it's important to locate who's the storyteller and where the project's conducted. Now, as I said, that could be anonymous as well. You could say it's an urban environment, or you could say it's a remote community, or it's a rural community with a diversity of nationalities and people from different backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds as well. The aims of the project would be important, and again, you could almost lift these directly from your grant applications or your work plan. Give an idea of the time frame and the organisations that are involved in the project, the people, why you felt you needed to do the project. And here again, you may want to use some statistics and actually paint a bit of a picture of the incidents or what's known about domestic and family violence in your project area, or it may be that your project is about trying to get a clearer picture and in fact say that that's what the aim is. What was done during the project, so whether you held community forums, you did training sessions, that's what that heading is around. What happened and what are the learnings? What worked well? Were there any critical success factors or any particular barriers that you found in this work in your community? Now, we're going to look at most of these questions with the example, but I think now we're going to stop before we move into those to get an idea from you. We're going to do a poll. I'm going to hand over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Liz. I'm just going to launch this poll now. And just for everybody who is listening today, just some very simple instructions here. If you could just select one or more of the following responses to the question, this template has multiple uses. Which of these are most relevant for you? Select as many of them as you like. So just select a response or multiple responses that are appropriate for you. We'll just leave it a few more seconds and we'll close the poll and we'll put the results out there so that we can see what the response is from all of you. So I will close the poll. Oh, we've just got a couple more seconds. I can actually see the percentage of the participants today, attendees today, have voted. If you would like to just respond to that question, give it a few more seconds and we'll close the poll now. Thank you for that. And I'll share the responses now, Liz.
Thank you, Tina. Okay. Okay, well, it's good to have that response back, and we'll look forward to hearing more from the participants about how you feel about the project story at the end of the webinar as well. But good to see that you're thinking it will be useful for reporting to your community and that there's an interest in a publication as well. Great. Okay, well, the next part of the webinar is really to talk about narrative and storytelling, and just to remind us all really that there is actually theory and method involved in what can seem quite simple, straightforward processes. Because while narrative and storytelling are highly associated with qualitative research methods, as I mentioned before, they can also be used and incorporate reporting about data collection such as surveys and audits. And we would like to acknowledge that we've used, particularly from the Indigenous health sector, this idea of a project story, and organisations such as the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisations, the Lowacha Institute and Vic Health and ANEMSA have used this approach with their grant projects as a way of sharing information about research and project work with participants in an accessible way. And I suppose the other thing is to stress that we're interested in finding out about what was planned, but we also think this approach allows us to talk about the unanticipated events and outcomes that can happen in project work. So stories often are associated with folklore, legends, myths. We use stories in song and literature, but we also have stories of local knowledge and narratives that emanate from interviews and focus group discussions. Stories can be used to collect and analyse information. They're also a powerful instrument of socialisation, and here I've put a reference to a wonderful South African sociologist, Bagal Chalisa, who's written a terrific book called Indigenous Methodologies, and that will be at the end of the webinar, and I'd highly recommend it to people that are interested in a closer look at this type of perhaps non-traditional methodology. Here I do want to mention that narratives are about allowing both the teller and the listener to gain an understanding and do an analysis together. So if you're using storytelling as a way of gathering information, the listener is often involved in helping to make sense of that information through the follow-up questions that they do. Okay, and the main point I'm wanting to make here is that we're not wanting to emulate or appropriate the place, role and value, and in some cases the ceremony that's involved with storytelling in Indigenous or other cultural groups. But we're aiming to allow project participants to use this way of sharing information, and if it is relevant within their cultural context, to value that as well. So the next slide also mentions some more contemporary uses that have been made of narrative and storytelling, both within therapeutic contexts, and here it's important to acknowledge that Australia has a great resource in the Dulwich Centre, which is based in Adelaide, but Michael White and his colleague David Epstein and also his partner Cheryl White have done a lot of work in developing narrative therapy. And narrative is also used in social justice work in a community context. There's a great book called Just Therapy that's been used in New Zealand. And in Australia, again, in an Indigenous context, we see the use of yarning as a form of storytelling, both in focus groups and community development. So Dawn Bessarab and her colleague have a particular article called Yarning About Yarning that I would recommend to people interested in further looking at that. And there is a value base to using story, and it comes from a theoretical context of empowerment theory, which uses diverse perspectives to challenge ways in which some groups may have been positioned. And here the Indian activist and theorist Arundhati Roy, I would highly recommend looking at her work where she talks about people needing to challenge stories of being othered and take their own stories of whom they are. Again, Chalisa, Paulo Freire, who is an educationalist that spoke about using stories and language and literacy as a way of empowering people, and Karen Martin, who is an Indigenous scholar that also looks at Indigenous methodologies. If we move on to the next slide, I did just want to draw your attention to some of the terms and concepts that we use in making sense of storying and using narrative data. So participants' voices, when we're looking at using stories, we want to look at not just one voice, but if there are different groups within our community that we've engaged with, we want to try and represent that diversity of views. Reflexivity is a strategy that we use to look at how we've storied and check the level of involvement we have as researchers. So what's the influence of our background and our perceptions and our ways of seeing things? What are our ideological biases and interests, and how does that influence how we are engaging with participants and reflecting on their stories? The issue of credibility in research is always important, and it is no less important in qualitative research. So strategies of credibility can include commenting on the kind of engagement that we've made. How long has that engagement been present? What sort of peer debriefing do we do? Are there negative case examples or alternative examples that we are storing as well? How do we monitor our subjectivity and verify the themes with the people we're working with? Triangulation is an important concept and strategy for ensuring or checking the credibility of research, and it can often mean using different methods. So not only interviewing, for example, but reviewing documents and minutes, and not only interviewing only one group of people, but interviewing more, or looking at alternative sources that might be even include looking at lyrics of songs. So that's partly the methods as well as the sources of data that you use can be triangulated. And having more than one researcher or investigator, particularly if you're coding your data in qualitative research. And that is an area that we did want to spend a little bit more time on, because you can use a thematic analysis to summarise the research findings within story and narrative, and do that in a way that makes the findings and the information you've gathered accessible to the local communication styles and groups that you're working with. So we'll just spend a little bit of time in the next couple of slides to talk about thematic analysis. And thematic analysis is a process that assists us to summarise our research findings in a way that can help us make sense of stories, narratives, and we can look at them over time and return to them. So it's about spending more time reading through narratives. So you read through the narratives and the stories more than once, and you have more than one person read through them to see what are the key quotes or key concepts or messages that are coming out from the stories that you may be using. So if we move on to the next slide there, we're talking about, for example, you may be keeping a reflective journal where you're looking at the way that you've been running meetings or the information that people are sharing with you about how they see the services in your town, for example. And as you note that down, you can move into a higher level, if you like, or another level of analysis where you look at the keywords, the concepts, and your reflections and do some coding on that. And coding is an iterative process, which means you come back to it time and time again just to keep checking on it. And here, according to Boytz's, a good code is one that captures the qualitative richness of a phenomena. It should be clear, concise, stating what its boundaries are and that you'd know when it occurs. So in the next slide, we give some examples to try and explain that. So a good thematic code should address 5 elements. What am I going to call it? And the example we've got here is it's authentic leadership. And how do you define what it is? So the example here says it's leaders that are true to themselves. The next question looks at how do I find it in the data? And here it's that you can see it when leaders say, they show through what they're saying that they're aware of their own values and others' values as well. What do I want to exclude? External forces that don't qualify as being part of that authentic leadership. Okay, now that reference we've got at the end of the presentation for you too. Now this is very step by step, and I hope that we're not losing too many people if it seems too basic. But let's move on, because I just want to show you in the next slide that when you're doing that coding, quite often it involves using lots of sticky notes. So you might pull out the quotes from the stories and put them all together where they seem to be saying similar things. And here's an example, in a way, of also using a photograph as part of your presentation or your storytelling. Now, I'm not sure if we're up to another code next, a poll, or if we should just move on to talking about the examples that we have. This was the example that we sent out in the generic template, and I think it may be more worthwhile if we move on to the next slide. That was going back. Sorry, Tina. That's all right. Yeah. That's a little bit more detail from that example. When you look at what happened, we've just got some suggestions there about it. When you're talking about what happened, it's not only events and activities, but it might be about newly formed relationships. And how you might share, making sense of the information you have. Could we move on to the next slide, Tina? Okay, this is the example that we have from one of our Building Safe Community projects that has been working with an Aboriginal family service. And they spoke about, they've used the template and described how the project story is about how people in that community came together with workers in a family violence prevention program. And we're saying that it became clear there were no resources that pertained to that specific community, and they decided it would be a worthwhile thing to create a local resource that they could use in a training package for family violence workers in their town. And if we move on to the next slide, they also mentioned that an action research approach was really valuable to them in developing that resource, the Plan, Act, Learn and Reflect process. Was useful to them because of the sensitive nature of the film, and they continually went back to get community support for making the film and the content within the film. And they redeveloped large components of the original script that they had, because in that process of consulting back with community, they found there were some aspects that were not acceptable to some members of the community, and some aspects that, even though they were hard, the community overall wanted to be included. So in that next slide, we're moving on to another example from a different community that spoke about their main aim, and this was a regional community, and the main aim of their project was to coordinate a whole of community response to both the crisis of family violence, to raise awareness amongst a broad range of groups within the community, and also to talk about what kind of prevention work might be undertaken within the community. So they've spoken about their project being about getting people involved with what they're doing, and they started off with a list of stakeholders, which were the manager of the Department of Community Services, some senior caseworkers in a family and community service agency, a teacher of community services, and a sexual assault counsellor. If we can move on to the next slide. The slide coming after will show how that original group moved and expanded, but what was done was they employed a coordinator, and the coordinator went through the process of engaging service providers and community members onto a local committee, and they, in the process of writing this project story, the coordinator noted that there were perhaps some things they still needed to do to get some more information for that committee. Next slide, Tina. Yeah, so this slide shows how the people and the organisations involved in this second community expanded. So they've now got the high schools, the primary schools, an elected counsellor and staff from their local government, the manager of corrective services, the police and specialist homeless services, and some local businesses are now involved in the group. So in the space of a year, they've grown from a smaller group of service providers who put in for the grant to a much larger group of people involved in this project, which is one of the important things they're talking about that's happened in their town.
Liz, it might be timely to bring up the second poll at this stage. Are you happy for that to
Absolutely.
Pop up now?
That sounds great.
Okay. Well, let's launch the second poll, which asks the question, does this template allow you to describe all the relevant information for your project, including context, outcomes, learnings and activities? So we're keen to know if this is the case. Could you answer yes or no or unsure? That would be helpful. We'll just leave it up for a few more seconds. I'll close the poll and we'll be able to have a look at how everybody's opinion regarding its relevance for your project. And I'll close the poll now, Liz, and I'll share the results for you.
Thanks. That's good. That's great. That's great to see that people feel that it is relevant, and totally understandable that some people are unsure because they may not have acquainted themselves yet fully with the template either. And can I say that we're very interested in any feedback you have about additional questions or ideas about how to share further information.
Sorry to jump in there, Liz.
No,
and I might also just mention at this stage too that a reminder to everybody that if you have any questions as Liz is going through, to just write them down into the field. You'll see the field at the bottom of your control panel there. Just type in the question and click submit, and Stephanie will be able to make sure that Liz has access to those questions throughout. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you. Now, I think if we move along to the next slide, that we've come back to the template again, which was some of the questions towards the end were particularly added in as a result of feedback at one of the workshops, I think in Perth, about project sustainability. And this is actually from the writings, the use that's been made from one of the projects, saying that there's challenges in the one-off funding and the need to look for further funding and other ways of supporting the project is really a key area of concern for this project. But they are noting that there has been some terrific collaborative partnerships formed, and they think that will keep going, and the challenge is to find time and ways to continue to share success stories about awareness raising, responding to family violence, and looking at prevention work. Now, there's one other project story, if we just move on, that we wanted to share from another community that spoke in general about that they've had a terrific response to the launch of the project, to feedback to training they've provided, which is the focus of their project, that through that they've developed stronger relationships, and that they also note that to truly understand the success of these types of projects requires a longer time, because so much of it has been about building relationships. And when you do training, you can get feedback at the time about how people found the training, but it's really down the track to see if they've been able to implement and use that training. So they're thinking about, beyond the funding period, even surveying some of the people that attended their training to see if it has had an ongoing relevance to the participants' work. Next slide is again about that particular family violence training, and they noted that there was quite a bit of pushback in some of the training sessions, with participants questioning whether the emphasis on violence against women is the only area of concern, and this is something that many of the projects mention, and we refer them to a particularly useful publication from Women's Health West called Dealing with Curly Questions. They also note that they had improved their own capacity and built their training skills, and that they were surprised to find that there is still some beliefs in the community that women provoke violence. If we move on to the next slide, they also said that there's quite a strong demand for the training, that it's difficult to engage some particular sectors, particularly because it can require having a trusting relationship built up over a period of time. They noted that action research is quite time intensive, and it can be difficult to get people to fill in surveys and participate in some of the tools they've developed. And that's something that the ARS team members, we're available and prepared to talk with people about how to manage some of those challenges on a case-by-case basis. Just moving on to the next aspect of the template, it's important to acknowledge the people that have helped when you're using a template like this, to acknowledge the local services and individuals and also the funders that have enabled this work to happen. And so we've given the example there of a generic locale community acknowledging the funding from the department and, for example, a local Rotary Club. So just on to the next slide, which is about nearly the second last one, unless we want to spend some time going through the whole template, is that we're hoping that all of the 40 projects would feel able to use the template to share their project stories with ANROWS, and as a first step, perhaps collectively share those stories at the next workshop, which is due to be held in Alice Springs at the end of June, on the 29th and 30th of June. And we've also asked that there are some specific aspects of the report to the department that could be shared with Building Safe Communities email list if people are happy for that to be done, and the footprints publication. And Steph, I might ask you if you'd like to ask any particular questions at this point, or if we've had any questions come in.
Yeah, so we haven't had no questions have come through yet, so now would be a good time if anyone has anything they would like to type into the chat. But one thing that I was just, that you touched on, Liz, that I thought might be good to go into a bit more detail was around the critical success factors and what kind of, what you would include in that category.
So did you have some examples from the communities, Steph, or are you asking?
It was just under, you just touched on it earlier, and I just thought it might be something we could expand on. So the critical success factors, for example, in the template, it gives a few examples like commitment to project from service managers and community leaders, linking training about attitudes with information about how to access services. So there are some examples there in the template that that go through what kind of things could be included as critical success factors. Just to expand on what you mentioned.
Could you mention some more of those, Steph?
The other example here is ethnic radio programs translated and delivered information about local services from written pamphlets, as some people are not literate.
Yeah, yeah. So that is about an example of using a variety of ways of getting information to your population groups, yeah?
Yeah.
That in some projects is really vital. I think the role of the project worker is also a critical success factor, and it can be a double-edged example in that if everything in the project rests only on the project worker, when the funding runs out, if you can't attract further funding, your whole project can fall over. So I use the concept, and here I wouldn't mind sharing from another project that recently was doing some planning for post-funding, if you like, and they decided that they would do an annual plan and create some sub-projects like running training, creating some stickers and messages to distribute through the networks in their local schools and community services, and doing some fundraising activities to support some emergency relief funds, and also looking at utilising stories for children. So they were looking at a range of different population groups and having sub-working groups. That meant it didn't rest on one leader. They could have project leaders, if you like, in each of their little sub-working groups. So there was a shared leadership model. So that would be an example of a critical success factor.
Mm.
It would be good to hear if anybody else wanted to mention.
If anyone who would like to make a comment now, you could also use the hands up function. I can see that Karina Backhouse has put her hand up. Karina, if you have a question, I could actually unmute you now, so we can give that a try to see, Karina, if you are actually wanting to ask a question. Just need to also confirm you've got a microphone, Karina. Can you speak to us now? No, Karina may not have a microphone, that's okay. But feel free to use the hands up functionality if you'd like to ask a question as well.
And I've just turned my webcam back on so that people don't feel they're asking questions or making comments only to a PowerPoint presentation. Okay. No questions or comments at this stage? Because we're just about at the end of the webinar. We've just listed all the resources.
Yes, there is. Sorry, I will just introduce Tricia. Now, Tricia has just put her hand up. So, Tricia, we will try to unmute you and see how we go there. Are you there, Tricia?
Hi. Have you got me
Hello
there?
there.
Yes,
Yeah.
hello, Tricia.
Hi, everyone. I'm just wondering whether other people have had the same thing as I have, Liz. I sent you through a question, but it doesn't seem to have arrived with you.
No.
So my question is around, I guess I was feeling as I was reading and listening to what you were saying about the examples, Liz, that they were a little bit more formal and report-like than I thought. And I'm just checking really that things like vignettes, quotes, snippets that kind of just capture some of those moments where you've learnt something or gained an insight, that's what we're really, that's some of the beauty of this, isn't it? That is what you're after. Yeah,
it is,
okay, great.
Totally. Thanks, Trish, for raising that. And it is the depth and the richness of vignettes that will really add to the examples. And I suppose it is more formal what we've drawn on for this presentation.
Oh, it's just great to know that because I'm trying to keep the beginnings of a reflective journal. It hasn't happened very often yet, but that's why I'm hoping to try and capture moments of my day, because that's where I'm actually learning bits about connecting with the communities that I'm wanting to connect with, that I think I will like to look on later, and I think might be useful for other people.
Great. And look, we're doing that too. The Action Research Support Team are reflecting on the visits that we do, and the way that we're working with that is that we usually send any notes that we've made and our reflections back to the project workers, and we've had positive feedback that that is useful to people. Yeah, good.
I might now also put Amy on mic. Amy has just more of a comment than anything. I'll just see, Amy, if your microphone is working.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Amy.
Yeah, we can, Amy.
Hi, I just, I guess, more thinking about just the sheer amount of data I have. Liz, you've seen, we've got hundreds of surveys from before and after training sessions, and then a reflection of mine from virtually every training session I've run, which is, you know, upwards of about 30 at the moment. So I'm just thinking about kind of the sheer amount of data. I really liked the idea of kind of looking at themes, and so I'm kind of thinking in my head about themes around kind of attitudinal questions and questions around the gendered nature of violence, because that's obviously something that's come up, but then also thinking about themes around people's knowledge of services, themes around kind of knowing how to respond to disclosures, and then also just a theme about the research aspect of the project and doing research. So even I had someone who was entering some surveys in the other day, and she was like, Amy, this batch of surveys is weird, because she said they're not consistent. And so we talked about why that might be, and I said, for example, that session had finished at 8:30 at night and people just wanted to leave, they were tired, they'd been at work all day, blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, I don't know if people were fully reading each question, and that's, you know, so even kind of thinking about some of those themes. So I guess
practical things around it. Yeah. And Amy, it's good if we can just clarify to people too that data entry is confidential within your organisation. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But great, because there's been some capacity building of staff within your organisation and trust that they can actually comment to you. Like, it's not just that they enter the data and don't make sense of it themselves in the process as well.
Yeah, I thought that was great because it actually helped me to have a helpful conversation, and I'm a kind of verbal learner in the sense that I often like talk things through, and so that helped me to come up with about like 3 different points that when I said those things to her, she went, oh, okay, that makes sense. And so, you know, while the data was for that particular session was very scattered, there was, you know, I could almost articulate for her, and she understood those reasons why it might be that way. So
yeah. Look, on this point, we're really happy to spend some more time with you around that. The point you're making, which is really of relevance, I'm sure, to everyone else attending the webinar, is that you do end up with a lot of data. And you plan for that in the beginning as to how much time it's going to take, and using some of the more recent software packages can be terrific. NVivo is a really useful computer software package that can help you with coding as well.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if that...
I think in my head, because I've been running trainings, been reading responses, you know, and I mean, even just now thinking that I'd probably add another like theme around relationships, because I think that plays a huge role. So even in my head, I guess I can see those themes coming through because you know, they've popped up time and time again while I've been reading both the quantitative data and also while I've been running training and kind of observing questions and observing kind of responses. So
So can I ask you just briefly, if this project didn't have an action research aspect to it, do you think that work would have happened?
I think that my organisation has a highly kind of like is very reflective, and so I think both my team leader and I operate in that way in general. But I don't think that we would have the same level of documentation. And I don't necessarily, so for every reflection I've written, I've used, like the plan and act was kind of more fairly obvious, but I've used that kind of idea of observing and then reflecting for each session, just so that helped me kind of, and so I just don't think that we would necessarily have the same amount of data because I've been much more aware of that as we've gone through, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I guess the point is now making sense of the data. Yeah.
I think I would say that idea, I mean, I just did it through kind of our database, but the idea for the person who said before, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name, but keeping those, I didn't see it so much as a reflection journal, but keeping notes about the observations that I had and the reflections on that has been really helpful. So I've kind of made a point of coming back to the office after every session that I've done and kind of highlighting, you know, what were some of the big points from today that I noticed or some of the things that came out of today. And that has been hugely helpful. So, yeah.
Yeah, and as I say, we're happy to spend some more time with you around that too.
Thank you.
No worries.
Now I think it's just going back to the office and just actually making sure that I put aside the time to sit down and go through it and start that process. So
yeah, good. And did we have any other questions? And firstly, did I answer your question or your comment adequately, Amy?
Yeah, you did. I think, again, that's probably just more of an example of me just liking to talk things through, so that's really helpful.
It's fine.
We don't have any more written questions that have come through, but if anyone wants to write something in now or put their hand up if they prefer to be unmiked, we could do that. But yeah, that's all of the written questions now.
Well, I think
Nothing else
if
coming
we
through,
do,
Liz? Yeah, sorry, I was
nothing
just
else?
saying, no, nothing else coming through at this point.
Okay, and do we need to just go through to the last? No, that's it.
Great. Well, I think the only thing to add at the end here, I think, Liz, is to mention, I'll turn my camera back on as well,
Great.
to mention that there will be a survey that will pop up. Do you want to speak a little bit about the kind of feedback that you're looking for?
Yeah, look, we are really asking people to let us know if this was useful or not, what was helpful, anything further, any further information around this particular topic or any other topics. Yeah.
Great. So when we close down the webinar in a moment, the survey will open up automatically, and it would be wonderful if you could just spend a couple of minutes just answering the questions and submitting them to Liz and Stephanie.
Actually, the other thing to add is I think we did have a couple of questions specifically to the Department of Social Service people that had attended, didn't we, Stephanie?
Yeah, there is, I think it's identified on the survey, so there is a question specifically to DSS on that survey. So that would be great to get your feedback. And I think we might have had one more poll question as well at the end here. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, we can launch the final poll question, which is just asking whether you would think you would like assistance to complete the template from the ARS team. So if you would like to just pop your response in there, and Liz or Stephanie will be back to you. Fantastic, everyone. I'll close down the poll in just a few seconds. Closing the poll now, and we'll share the results.
Okay. Thank you for taking the time to do that, and we'll follow up with people. And can I just, as we do close, thank people for making the time to attend the webinar. Remind you that we have another webinar on the 20th of April that's looking more about measurement, and we'll have a couple of our expert people from ANROWS on board. And before that, we'll send out and give you the opportunity to raise any questions you may want them to specifically address during that webinar.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for attending, everybody. We'll close up the webinar now. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Stephanie. And
thank you,
we will
Tina.
see you at the next session. Thank you, everybody.
You will. Okay. Bye now, everyone. Thanks again.